I could say that we have a national interest in helping more of humanity get to explore the moon and build a future in cislunar space and around the moon.
Hello, welcome to the Space Policy Show. I'm Colleen Stover with the Aerospace Corporation. Today's episode, Forging Ahead in Cislunar, is number 125. So it's kind of a milestone for the show. I'm kind of impressed with everything we have under our belt so far. All the episodes are arranged by playlists of interest on our YouTube channel, and of course available by podcast as well. Today, we've got Jamie Morin, Director of our Center for Space Policy and Strategy, and he's talking to Matt Daniels, former Assistant Director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy for Space Security and Special Projects. They'll be talking about the National Strategy for Cislunar S&T, the first of its kind to be released by the US government, and some of the thinking that went on into creating the strategy, how interoperability plays into the future cislunar ecosystem, and the role of government now and in the future. Thanks for joining.
Well, welcome back, everybody, to the Space Policy Show. It is a pleasure to have Dr. Matt Daniels with us today. Matt, as you heard from Colleen, is the Assistant Director at the White House's Office of Science and Technology Policy with responsibility for space security, and he has been just one of the nation's leading thinkers on laying the groundwork for our future in cislunar space. So, Matt, it is terrific to have you on the Space Policy Show this week.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So it is now nearly a year since the National Cislunar Science and Technology Strategy was released, and it's a really significant first step to sketch out the path to the future in cislunar. We have a pretty expert audience for this show, but one of the things I wanted to compliment you and the OSTP team on was that this strategy did a really nice job of actually defining cislunar space in a way that makes sense. And not every report on cislunar has done such a good job. So you guys laid it out as the three-dimensional region of space, which is outside the Earth's geosynchronous orbit, but where the gravitational influences of the Earth and the Moon predominate. And I thought that was a really nice way to do it that captured all the critical points. So anyway, thanks for that. And for our audience, that when we're talking about cislunar, that's what we mean. The strategy document, started with, I think, a super important point. It says the United States is going to seek to lead the world in responsible, peaceful, sustainable exploration and utilization of cislunar space. And that we're going to do it based on our space priorities framework we've laid out, and we're going to do it, consistent with the values that the U.S. brings to operation in the world. Let me ask you that this strategy that you spent, a significant amount of time working, where you're on now, what progress have we made?
That's a great question to start with. In creating this national cislunar strategy, wanted to take a first step. We know it will need to be followed by other steps. So we want there to be follow-on strategies. We want there to be follow-on national policies, but we needed a first step to start to offer a new way of thinking at the national level about this region of space. And we can go into that as we talk. But as you said, we just released the strategy last November. And then since then, we've been asking departments and agencies, this long iterative process for them to come up with implementation plans and also communicating it publicly, so giving talks about it. I think we are already seeing ingredients surfacing in a lot of different places that are showing the kind of beginning of a new direction on this topic. So specifically, kind of progress that's been made. All of that with a preface of this is meant to be a long-term endeavor, but progress has already been made just in the first few months. I think we see places like NASA prioritizing in new ways cislunar infrastructure. So if you look at NASA's Moon to Mars framework, there's a whole piece on lunar infrastructure and things that they'll be doing in cislunar space. We have multiple parts of the US government thinking about lunar geodetic systems and how we standardize time and how we think about kind of routinizing growing sets of activities in the vicinity of the moon in ways that parallel. If you think about why we even standardized time, for example, in the United States, it was partly so trains could scale up on the quantity of tracks across North America. So we're doing the foundational things to enable growth in this region of space. We have places like the Department of Commerce thinking about how our space catalog and the future of our space catalog will expand into cislunar space and how we will publicly share tracking data of things moving in this region of space. So the United States is also the go-to place worldwide for understanding what's happening in this region of space. I think we have a new generation of private companies that are looking at how the US government is talking and behaving and setting out a vision and a strategy and adjusting their activities accordingly, which is extremely welcome and exciting, because part of the vision here is that we are a country that has an extraordinary space program, but we are also increasingly a spacefaring country and a spacefaring society. And so we have a new generation of many more actors thinking about how we're going to go into the region of space around the moon. And then we have new international discussions about longer term activities in this region of space. And we have a new generation of young people who are thinking and writing and debating about our long-term futures at the moon and on the lunar surface, and imagining positive futures that they will get to build of humans having an ongoing presence at the moon and on the moon.
I really like how you've laid that out, and you're capturing the democratization of the domain, right? Many more actors, lower barriers to entry. And I thought this was really one of the critical points in the strategy that is maybe underappreciated. And you started hinting at it, right? That there's this explicit objective in, I think, your third and fourth objectives in the strategy, which are really in a sense about lowering the barriers to entry.
Yes.
Building space situational awareness capability, building communications capability, building position, navigation, and timing capability, all of those things done in ways that are can scale up as human activity expands there. And that strikes me as getting at some of those critical utility functions that are make it easy for so many other activities to occur. Do you, as you thought through the creation of those four major objectives in the strategy, was there any dissent on this view that the US could maximize our national interest by actually contributing to a much broader ecosystem of players, foreign partners, companies, and so forth?
I would say that's also a good question. And this is the space policy show. So, part of making policy and trying to draw people to a vision here in Washington, D.C. is you have a lot of discussions with people who start from very different ways of thinking, and you have to kind of draw them into a vision and a shared understanding. So once we did that, I think the particular pillars of this very first cislunar strategy came into focus pretty clearly. We partly were able to begin to bring kind of a logical arc into focus of how this can fit in to future thinking for the United States and future national interest for the United States. I am, so why don't we start with that? I'm very much of the view that space activities endure when they're aligned to our own national interest, when they're tied to our enduring national interest. So I'm very interested in how we make, for example, civil and scientific activities also fit into bigger national interests for the United States, like foreign policy and our role in the world, and how we make that bridge. I have a personal philosophy that actually also has an arrow going the other way, which is I think when we as a country succeed in tying or seeing our self-interest, our national strategic interest, partly lensed through long-term positive futures, and including positive futures for humanity expanding into space, that is at our best part of what makes us exceptional as a country. That is what makes us a country that is not just based on a particular geography on Earth or particular, kind of religious and ethnic heritage, but is based on an idea and a set of ideas and a political philosophy. And so if you let me talk long enough on these things, I will ultimately end up kind of in that corner of stuff because this is the space policy show. But in this case, tying it to national interest, the tie here was we have, first of all, a situation where multiple countries around the planet have expressed interest in going into cislunar space and especially to the moon. It includes governments and private actors. A subset of those actors, we think, have credibly expressed intent to create the beginning of an enduring presence. We're in the very, very early years of this. But we see this kind of appetite and capacity to begin to create ongoing, enduring activities. And in fact, this is how we talk as a country too. We talk about going to stay. So in that context, I would also start by saying we have an additional national interest to start thinking about and bringing into focus, which is, first of all, we want there to be a rules-based system. Just as we spent a great deal of effort in the 70 plus years after World War II helping to build and sustain a rules-based international system here on Earth, we want that to exist in space. We say that often, and we don't just want it to end at GEO or something like that. We want it to extend into outer space. We also want to make sure that we, with the values of liberal democracy and open science and free markets, bring those values into shaping a leadership role and shaping any evolution of that rules-based system. So one good way of doing that is a lot of things that we are historically good at doing, grand achievements in outer space, especially at the moon. But there's this new set of things, which I think is can build on the fact that we are a country that has worldwide allies around the planet, and we are a country with a vibrant commercial sector that aspires to do things in this region of space. And those are strengths that we can double down on. And by kind of, as you said, lower barriers to entry or open pathways to entry and use by these aligned rule-following actors, we can bolster a presence in this region of space that will support an international rules-based system and that will want to work in partnership with us to build a positive future in this region of space. And so if you kind of then think about how do we go about doing that, you get to the pillars of this first cislunar strategy.
What I'm sort of hearing you say is that we've got a lot of ships in the water, and so it's in our interest to have a rising tide lift all boats, because many of our boats are already out there and will benefit from the rising tide.
Yes, and we are the kind of country that has friends around the planet. Most of the world are partners of the United States, if not allies. And so I like this because if I were to say, way more succinctly everything I just said, I could say that we have a national interest in helping more of humanity get to explore the moon and build a future in cislunar space and around the moon. And I think that's a neat, kind of very appealing heart of this, for me at least.
That's well said. Matt, you're known as somebody who thinks deeply about historical and cross-domain analogies for novel technology, space, and otherwise. And I didn't mention this, but you obviously worked also on cutting-edge issues like artificial intelligence in your career. That's something I certainly appreciate. I had seminal experiences in my early career doing work for the Pentagon's Office of Net Assessment on the precedents of the Royal Navy in the 19th century for response to technological disruption. Talk me through and talk our viewers through when it comes to the near to medium term future of cislunar space, so next decade or so, not the more speculative distant future. What do you see as the most instructive analogies for us, and where do we hit the limits of those analogies and need to recognize that they won't take us all the way?
That's a great question as well. If I can, would be reaching here to the history of Rome or Babylonian civilizations, if I could possibly find a way to. So with that assurance, I'll say we actually found historical analogs mostly in the 19th and 20th centuries. And we found three have been resonating and recurring especially. One was actually the Eisenhower era of spaceflight. When we as a globe and when we as a country in particular were taking our first steps into outer space, precedents mattered enormously. And so there was this kind of formative period. You think of the Soviet Union launching Sputnik and the fact that we allowed overflight and the kind of early years where those kinds of precedents mattered enormously. So I think for the next decade, as we have much more activities happening in this region of space, we found as we were discussing this that we need to be very thoughtful on an ongoing basis over the next decade about the kind of precedents we create in a formative period. And that's going to be thoughtful about what we do. It's also going to be thoughtful, though, about when others do things, how do we respond? Do we support it as a precedent, or do we contest it? And how do we think about those kinds of things? We're going to have to be kind of on our feet as things are happening at the moon over the next decade. The second was actually the long history of Antarctica. And specifically, there are 150 years of human experience in Antarctica before the Antarctic Treaty began. And so I ended up finding a lot of weekends spent reading the kind of early history of Antarctica and thinking about the longer history of nations jostling in Antarctica and what lessons can we take from that, especially as we try to set out for this positive future that can learn from history and reflect the future we want to build in this region of space. And then the third kind of historical analog was actually much more recent, just the last few decades, and how we think about technological infrastructure here on Earth. And thinking about, if you look at GPS, if you look at ARPANET, which led to the creation of the internet, if I talked about standardization of time before, that early kind of standards and technological infrastructure can endure much longer than sometimes its inventors expect, and can shape the long-term future in really profound ways. And so to the degree possible, we should be conscious of that as we build out the earliest kinds of cislunar infrastructure. We emphasize cislunar information infrastructure, so things like communications and PNT, but want to be conscious of we might be shaping a very long decades ahead future by the kinds of early choices we make in that infrastructure.
So along those lines, Matt, my colleagues Chris Guidi and Ron Burke have been doing some writing lately where they've been calling for what they call an ecosystem approach to cislunar development, and sort of starting with a recognition it's a domain with many independent actors, and that functions differently than a centrally planned one, right? The Apollo program, if NASA figured out how they were going to mobilize industry to put people on the moon, it was not a simple engineering problem, but in some sense, a simplified bureaucratic and organizational problem, because it was largely within one organization's control. We now have something on the order of 80 companies that have announced they're planning some sort of cislunar project. Now, many of those may not come to fruition, but that's a big number. That's a lot of actors. And it clearly will have some level of evolutionary behavior, right? Where companies and countries adapt their plans, change their approach. Some die out. Some businesses fail because they didn't have a model. Others succeed beyond their wildest dreams and flourish. How do you think about that ecosystem aspect in this democratized space world? And I mean, you talked about a need to update and build subsidiary plans and keep coming back to the strategy as these things happen. But is there more than just that? Is there more than revisiting? And is there something inherently different about planning for this ecosystem, highly adaptive and evolutionary environment?
I think that's also a great question. We did take this kind of fostering and growing an ecosystem approach, or mindset at least, rather than assuming that we're going to somehow centrally plan kind of the future of everything at the moon or something like that. Part of that's also being a good international partner. We want our allies and partners around the planet to come work with us and to want to work with us. And we can help them think about ways to do that. We can offer opportunities, but it's not going to be, you know, us walking out and saying, you're building this and you're building that. That's just not really the way the world is likely to work right now. But we can say, we have this vision and we're going to be doing the following things and we're going to be eager to partner with you. And so a good starting point is thinking about having others want to work with us and bringing kind of their diverse perspectives on how they're going to go about that and make that a strength, a long-term strength of the United States. I think same thing with the private sector. One of the really exciting things here is we think and hope that we're going into an era where we don't just have a government space program going into cislunar space and going to the moon, but the moon could be this place where many parts of our society are getting to send things and explore and do new things. And that creativity and that vitality is exactly what we want to build on as a strength and help grow a positive future from that. And that too doesn't come, I think, from centrally planning it ahead of time. It's kind of setting out a vision and trying to set a role, a positive role for the government that's consistent with our national interests and that can also lead in being the international organizer and a supporter of new non-government activities.
That's let me ask you to drill just a little bit deeper here. So in the strategy, you talk, as we said, about space situational awareness, communications, position, navigation, timing. What in each of those areas, what do you see as our biggest needs? And are there areas where you think the U.S. government really has to step up and get after it itself, and then other parts where, you know, we'll be able to foster or help with standard setting, but can, you know, be in a more follower or surfer kind of mode?
That's a good question with a kind of multi-part answer. So I would say maybe to begin, I see the most important roles for the government as being these pillars of this first cislunar strategy. So what kinds of federally funded research and development can the US government invest in that's maybe not likely to be done or is harder to do by allies and private actors? And we can do some extraordinary things with places like NASA. A second is we know that we are still a hub of global science, and we will be for the long future. And that too is something that we should bring to this, and we should continue to increase international cooperation around exploration of the moon, and especially global scientific communities who want to explore the moon. So that's a really kind of public science role as well, public government role as well. SSA and early information infrastructure, I think we have opportunities, a lot of opportunities for, everyone talks about public-private partnerships these days, but I think that is still the right answer here. We will have opportunities to fund private companies to do big parts of this, and then the government can do what is not addressable by the market. But I think this SSA piece and this information infrastructure piece is really near the heart of this too, because we can look at a comparison between the flourishing in low Earth orbit over the last 15 years and the beginning of the space age. And so if you look at kind of, speaking of an ecosystem, the kind of growth and diversity of activities that have emerged in low Earth orbit over especially the last 15 years, a big part of that is dropping launch costs. But the other large piece of that is a lot of other things are much easier today than they have ever been before. So at the beginning of the space age, when you launched a satellite, you had to worry about finding your satellite after you launched it. You had to worry about passing over ground stations that you had access to and then getting your data all the way back. You had to worry about knowing where your satellite was as it went around the Earth. And today, all of that is easier. You can, first of all, the US government provides course tracking for everyone. You can buy high fidelity tracking for yourself and others as a commercial service. You can put a GPS chip on your satellite and know where it is at all times. You can buy data downlink as a service, and none of that exists yet at the moon. But we know that in things the US government will be doing at the moon, look at NASA's Artemis program, we will need communications and navigation capabilities. We'll need space tracking capabilities. So if we pursue these capabilities in a way that also makes them likely to be scalable and shareable and interoperable, we can actually use things that we're already going to need anyway to create the early steps for cislunar infrastructure, and then from there to pursue these kind of longer term goals that we've been talking about up to this point.
So the functions you're talking about there, Matt, are all areas where there's advantages to interoperability and interdependence among different service providers, right? If Space Situational Awareness Company A and the government are publishing data in incompatible formats or different references, we introduce frictions. Obviously, true for comm activity. What kind of tools does the U.S. government have available to it to foster interoperability and, where appropriate, interdependence among these diverse actors in the cislunar domain?
I think archetypal, first of all, of what you just described is we have this old way of thinking about cataloging systems in near-Earth that originally dates back to two-line elements because it was punch cards in computers. And to some degree, we still have databases that kind of have grown with difficulty over time from those origins. And of course, that entire approach doesn't work well when you can have three-body problem trajectories and be moving in halo orbits around L points and things like that. So something, first of all, that the government can bring is a kind of exploratory research and development and information sharing and publicly sharing information about, this seems like a good way to track and build catalogs of orbits. And private companies can say, no, we came up with a better way. We think you should buy from us and use this other approach. And then the government can adapt, but the government can still start with this open, shareable research and analyses that can allow kind of all boats to rise. The government can also, as it needs things, buy services. So here's where we found, interesting examples from Antarctica. When we talked to NSF, they pointed out that the use of private companies, I don't think I'm sharing inside baseball from NSF on this, but they told us when we were learning about this, that the use of private companies for things like vehicles in Antarctica actually creates a standardization when multiple governments buy from the same companies or from the same kind of ecosystem of companies. And then if one country's station or systems have a problem and they need spare parts, we are more likely to be able to exchange spare parts because we're kind of buying and operating from the same global ecosystem of private actors. So I think condensed, the US government can be a source of demand for early things in this region of space, as we need to be meeting our own goals anyway for exploration at the moon in particular. There will be opportunities to buy from private companies that can also enable this longer term interoperability and enable this longer term growth.
I think that's a really interesting point, and it intersects with an issue that another set of my colleagues have been talking about for a few years now, which is the in-space rescue gap. You talk about interoperability, right? And we just recently had this significant experience with a deep sea submersible on a tourism mission to the Titanic, where there was an expectation when something went very wrong that the U.S. government would be first to step up and try to conduct a rescue operation. In space, as in the deep sea, it's not going to be enough to get close if somebody's in trouble. If you had an incompatible airlock, I mean, you're going to be in the horrific situation of being there but not able to help. As you think about standard setting, is human spaceflight safety and rescue one of those issues that will probably evolve its way into the next iteration of the strategy as we're getting more human activity in Cislunar, presumably with Artemis and maybe other programs moving forward?
I expect that it will. It's also fantastically easy for me to say that for my successors, to then pick up and have to develop. So I'll say, yes, that sounds very logical. I think it is not something we're facing quite yet, but it's, as you say, I think we should expect that we will have to think about this in the years ahead. This is also an area where NASA gives a great model, because NASA can be maximally transparent about, we do things this way, we have this set of practices and tacit knowledge about why this is the best way, and NASA can talk about all that. So I think there'll be some kind of interesting nuance on this too, to think about, in addition to just, particular, say, potential future rescue capabilities that the government might have.
Yeah. You've spent a lot of time working on this broad strategy. You also have responsibilities on space security issues, which are obviously a big deal in looking at the next decade or two of perhaps intense geopolitical tension. I want to kind of close us out today with a brighter and I think critically important note. In the Cold War, which was a period of enhanced geopolitical tension, the race to the moon, the space program, I think broadly, they served as a source of inspiration and hope, not just on a national level, but on a global level. We're seeing a little bit of that right now with the jubilation in India over the successful landing of their first lunar mission. It will presumably play out as other nations and the U.S. continue to do first of a kind or path-breaking activities. What do you see as the most significant steps in our upcoming cislunar development for those inspirational and public diplomacy goals?
I think what a wonderful note to end on too. Maybe two things. First of all, a vision where the United States sees its national interest partly in terms of helping to open up this region of space to more of humanity. And that is resonant with a way of American thinking that I think you could look at a span all the way from Meriwether Lewis and how he and Thomas Jefferson were thinking about a kind of marriage of national interest and Enlightenment ideals, to John F. Kennedy's choice to reach for the moon as a strategic goal for the United States, and the fact that he chose that as that will be the tool through which we'll pursue solutions to our geopolitical challenges over a span of years. I think this is something that this is an area where we have an opportunity to demonstrate that the United States that our best years are ahead of us, and where we can be the builders of positive futures. And we need not look back to even the Apollo era necessarily for these things, but that our kind of most exciting steps and our most exciting futures are actually perhaps just on the cusp of being in front of us now?
Well, hopefully this strategy document helps to set out a path for that. And I do think it's really important that in laying it out, you guys recognized it's important what we do. It's also very important how we do it. And the fact that we're doing it in a way that's aligned with US values and a raising all boats kind of approach, and bringing in partners in a very proactive way. All of those things, I think, really do increase our chances both of success and of the impact in the broader society of the success that we are hopefully on a path to achieve. So, Matt, I really want to thank you for taking the time to be with us on this Space Policy Show episode. As always, you're an incredibly agile and sophisticated thinker about the challenges facing us and how to really seize opportunity out of those challenges and set us on a good course. Thanks for your public service and for your time with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Wow, indeed, a great conversation. The idea of how long-term US national interests are actually vested in all of humanity enjoying the fruits of our advancements in space and on the moon, that resonates with me personally. So thank you, Matt and Jamie, for being on our show. Everyone, you can check out more episodes and our research and events at csps.aerospace.org. Follow us on YouTube or by podcast. And thank you to our technical team, James Liggins and Max Siegel. So long, everyone.